Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 669 for the 7th of Tishrei in a regular year. As a heads up to today's episode, maybe a little bit of a disclaimer here, I want to kind of just remind myself maybe and remind you guys as to why I decided to do this podcast and what I was hoping for this podcast to be. So, and what I was hoping it would not become, and which I don't want it to become. So I don't want this podcast to be a shir, just another Tanya shir. There are lots of Tanya shirim out there, and I encourage all of you to go listen to some Tanya shirim as a nice addendum to this or to your own learning. The difference with this podcast and what I was really hoping to get out of it, and what I've been, thank God, usually I feel like I'm somewhat accomplishing, is to really make the Tanya accessible, to not just learn the Tanya in this kind of like academic scholarly way, but to really make these concepts relatable and tangible and practical for my everyday life, and hopefully for my listeners' everyday life to some extent. Now, sometimes this is easier than others. Sometimes I read the Tanya and I'm like, oh, wow, this really reminds me of something that I just went through in my life or something I read or whatever. Other times it's a little bit more difficult and it takes a little bit more work. So I will say today's Tanya is a very dense one. It gets quite esoteric, and it took me a lot longer to prepare this episode than some of the other ones I have in the past. There's a lot there. It's quite esoteric, and we're really getting into the nitty gritty, and it's a little technical. But at the same time, I did want to make it relatable. And so it took me a while. And I'm kind of hoping that this idea will come out as somewhat relatable. So stick with me, and hopefully we can go through this journey together. And together we can come to have this Tanya be very real and enriching our lives. So for context, just to kind of bring it into zone in on where we're at, this epistle that we've been learning, this epistle 20, the topic and kind of like the theme or where we're going with it all is really the importance of our physical worlds and the greatness of our physical worlds, the greatness, the special uniqueness of us here in this world, and specifically related to the idea of creation ex nihilo. And we already started talking about this in previous episode, this idea of what is so amazing about, like, really first of all pointing out this uniqueness of ex nihilo and how it's not something to really be taken for granted, and how regular creation, usually whether we're talking about physical creation or spiritual creation, is actually happens in a more causal way. It happens in a more evolutionary way. Like usually things in the world, there's like a cause and an effect. We talked about like the chicken and the egg, or it's like anything, right? Even if somebody here, wants to invent something, you're inventing something based on other things that exist down here, or a person puts together a piece of machinery or makes a sculpture or something. They're taking raw material and they're making it into a different form. They're not actually creating anything new. And we actually spoke about how this is actually what Hashem does in the spiritual worlds, that as throughout all of the spiritual worlds, there's this chain of descent, this evolutionary pattern that happens, this cause and effect. It's called in Hebrew Ila ve'alu, that creates most of the worlds. Like that really is like all of the spiritual worlds that are above us go through this evolutionary descent of cause and effect. And the exception to this is our physical world, which is what is really unique about our physical world, which is this creation something from nothing, this creation ex nihilo. Because we spoke about this idea that physicality is something that is so totally different than spirituality, and how thus it's like, how is it? It's not an evolutionary thing. Like, you can't evolve from spirituality to physicality. It's two totally separate things. So the leap, the jump from spirituality to physicality was such a tremendous leap that it really was this idea of something from nothing. We talked about this idea about how God is not spirituality. People mistakenly make that assumption that when we talk about spirituality, it's synonymous with God or godliness, and they're really not one and the same at all. And in fact, true godliness is both spiritual and physical. And not only that, we spoke about how God is also not infinite. God is infinite and finite. God is both of these things. God created these terms. He created these definitions. So when we talk about God, God is really the source of both spirituality and of physicality. And what we're going to be really focusing in on today is this idea that, in fact, not only is God the source of spirituality and physicality, but there's actually something about this power of ex nihilo, which is the ultimate source of physicality, in which God's essence is actually a little bit more, it's actually more present. It's more, not that it's not there in other cases, but it's more expressive. God's essence is more expressive in his power of ex nihilo than it is in his power of causality, in other words. Another way to say this in more kind of Kabbalistic terminology is that the creation ex nihilo comes about specifically through the vessels, through God's vessels. So we know that there are two primary modes by which God expresses himself. There's the vessel, there's the mode of light, which is very radiant. It's very expressive. It's sort of like a person. When we say let your light shine, we mean like, express yourself, really be out there. And when we think of a vessel, we think of that as being much more contained, much more concealed, much more hidden. And so it's kind of like this like counterintuitive thing where, while that's true on the one hand, on the other hand, we know that when it comes to expression, light is by nature limited, because you can only express so much. You can only express, even if you speak many, many words or whatever, at some point those words are going to end. If you draw many paintings or whatever, that at some point you're going to run out of ink, right? Versus a vessel, the power of a vessel is it's infinite, because a vessel is not the ink. The vessel is the paper that you're drawing on, or the space that you're drawing on, or the paintbrush itself, which can create infinite numbers of paintings. And we began talking about the origin spiritually of these vessels. Where does it come from within the map of godliness? So we know that in Kabbalah, there's like this kind of map of godliness, which is the way by which God expressed himself to us. So obviously there's a level of God that's beyond all of this. That's like essence of God that we can't access, that we cannot ever understand. But on the other hand, when we look in Kabbalah, when we look in Chassidus, it does give us this map, which is like kind of something that God gave us. It's like a map to try to grasp somewhat of him, to try to understand God, at least insofar as how he chose to reveal himself to us. So within this map, we spoke about the fact that there are four general worlds. There's Atzilus, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. And we spoke about the idea that Atzilus is the highest of all the worlds, and it's actually really unique and different than the other worlds in the sense that it's not really a world in the fullest sense, because the world is the concept of olam in Hebrew. It comes from the word helem, to hide. And when we say a world, it means something other than God. There's God and then the world that he creates. So really the first world, like in the fullest sense, is actually the second world, which is the world of Bria, the world of creation. That's when an actual creation happens. There's something, when you create something, it's something other than you. But when we talk about the world of Atzilus, which is above the world of Bria, this is the world of emanation, and that's the world which is really in the realm of theory. It's in the realm of the theoretical. We likened it to sort of like in the conception of a child. It's before the child is actually conceived. It's where the potential of the child exists in the body and the mind of the mother and father. It's there, but exists in potential. And insofar as it exists in potential, it has no separate entity of its own. The child is one with the mother and the father. This is the world of Atzilus. So this world of Atzilus is going to be kind of like our abode for the next little while. And today we're going to be kind of like exploring within this world of Atzilus, like what is going on there. And we've actually started this journey, right? So yesterday we spoke about the idea that the origin of this this power of creation ex nihilo comes from a place within Atzilus that's called the Malchus of Atzilus, and it's specifically the vessels in the Malchus of Atzilus. So, meaning to say that the origin of this ability, this ex nihilo power, comes from the vessels of the 10 spheros that are found in Malchus of Atzilus. And we spoke about some other things that come from this place of the vessels of the Malchus of Atzilus, amongst which one of the things was the bodies of the angels come from that place. So that's all a recap of yesterday. Today, we're going to talk about this interesting category of things which are found within Atzilus, and they are somewhat kind of like reminiscent and resemble in certain ways the vessels of Malchus of Atzilus, but yet they're actually one step below that. They're actually not exactly the vessels of Malchus of Atzilus, and they're actually not the vessels of anything within the world of Atzilus. They're actually one step below the vessels within Atzilus. And so what are these things that are one step below the vessels? These are, interestingly, the souls of the angels and the souls of Jewish people. So very interesting. So this is again an example of, like, when we think of spirituality, when we think of souls, we tend to think of that as being higher. We tend to think of that as being loftier, as more godly in a way than physicality, than coarse physicality. But what the message of today's Tanya, at least what I took out of it, is that's actually not the case at all. And that while on the one hand, yes, there is a more like kind of etherealism to these spiritual forces, this spirituality itself actually handicaps them in a way and limits them and doesn't let them manifest truly beyond their world. They're stuck in that world of Atzilus. They cannot create something from nothing the way that the vessels can. So let's get into the text now and just see how the Alter Rebbe explains all of this, and we'll kind of try to explain these ideas more as we go along. And again, for context, we are in the middle of Epistle 20 of Iggeres HaKodesh today. And so the Alter Rebbe begins, and he says that the souls of the angels, and this is in contrast because yesterday, again, we spoke about the bodies of the angels and how the bodies of the angels came from these vessels in Atzilus, right? But now, by contrast, now we're going to talk about the souls of the angels. The souls of the angels came about through what's called the Zivug Hanshikin. It's a union of kissing. So there was a kissing of the spheros. It was the spheros kissed. And then when we say the souls of man came about through the union of the Zer Anpin and the Nukva of Atzilus. So again, not to get too Kabbalistic, but the Zer Anpin is the 6 emotive attributes. The Nukva is the Malchus of Atzilus, that last attribute in Atzilus. So the union of the 6 emotive attributes, which are masculine, and the feminine Malchus, this within the world of Atzilus, this creates the souls within the world of Atzilus before they come down into the lower worlds of Bria, Tzir, and Asiya. And so these two things, we're talking about the souls of the angels and the souls of people. These cannot be put in the category of being a yesh. They're not what we call a something or something. They don't have any substantial existence in and of their own. But rather, we say that they are like an aspect of godliness that is very, very contracted. And it's like the vessels of the 10 spheres of Atzilus, which are limited in nature. So at first glance, this seems to be saying that these souls of the angels and the soul of man are the same thing as the vessels, but it doesn't say that they're the same thing as the vessels. It's saying they're like the vessels. And the reason why they're like the vessels is because just like the vessels of Atzilus have limitations to them, so too do these things, these souls of the angels and the souls of men, they are limited in nature. And the way that they become limited in nature is through the great contraction of the light, of the infinite light, which is called the kav. So the kav, or in English, it's called the line or measuring stick. This is a Kabbalistic concept that comes up in Chassidus a lot. The kav is like the origin of everything, the origin of creation. So what happened was basically God decided that he wanted to create something apart from him. He wanted to create a world. He wanted to create many worlds, right? In order to bring about our physical world into existence. That was like the final purpose. And so in order to do that, step one was actually to remove himself, to actually make space for other, because really ultimately nothing exists other than God. So in order for there to be an other, God had to first remove himself and make space for other. That's what's known as the Tzimtzum Harishon, the first contraction. After that first contraction, okay, so God totally removed himself, so to speak, at least from the visible, from the perceptible experience of otherness. Then he slowly put himself back in. But the way he did this was in a very, very measured way. Just like, let's say if an artist wants to make a painting, the first thing they have to do is they have to actually like clear the space. They have to like, make sure there's nothing on the table or whatever, and then slowly they will not open up the paint and just pour it onto the paper, but they're going to put it down in a very measured degree. They're going to even probably measure out which paint they're going to use, which colors are they going to use first, how much are they going to use, what kind of paintbrush are they going to use, all that stuff. That's what the kav is for God. The kav is the measuring stick through which he said, okay, now I have space. I have this blank slate, this empty palette. What am I going to put there? So that figuring out what I'm going to put there, that measurement, that ability to actually measure, that's what's known as the kav. So the kav is the origin of everything we know of as finitude. So going back to our text, why we're bringing up the kav here is we're saying that this kav is vested within these souls of the angels and within these souls of people, which gives them this limitation, and this is why they're likened to the vessels of the spheres of Atzilus, and this kav is vested within the souls. Specifically, we're talking about the souls within the different levels of the souls. Within specifically, the Alter Rebbe focuses on the internal aspects, the levels of the souls, the nefesh, ruach, and neshama of the souls. So this kav is vested within their nefesh, ruach, and neshama, and the Alter Rebbe actually likens this to what happened in the Tzimtzum Harishon, in the first Tzimtzum, what happened. So again, where God created this void, and then God brought back that measuring stick, the kav, in order to create the world. This kav, similar to, is how godliness is vested within these souls. So the point of it is basically the bottom line that the Alter Rebbe is bringing here, from what I understand, is he's basically telling us that these souls, whether we're talking about the souls of angels, the souls of men, it's definitely, especially we're talking about in the world of Atzilus, they radiate godliness. It's like there is nothing but godliness, but yet they do have something in common with the kelim, with the vessels, in the sense that they're limited. Their radiance is limited. It's measured out. Each neshama has a very specific radiance to it. Every angel has a very specific definition to it, right? And when we talk about the souls of the angels, who are these angels exactly? The souls of men, the souls of people, they have a specific definition to it. But even if their definition is pure godliness, and by virtue of the fact that they have this specific definition, they actually become a slave to their definition, as we'll see, because the Alter Rebbe goes on and he says that we see that even after these souls eventually came down from the world, from Atzilus to this world. So we know that the not all souls come from Atzilus. Different souls come from different worlds, but the souls of tzaddikim tend to come from this world of Atzilus, this highest world. And we see that the original tzaddikim, the original really righteous people, then they were so defined by this the soul level of their origin, of the soul level of Atzilus. This was their whole definition, that they could not be anything other than godliness. They were actually, even though they were actually physical people down here who had physical mortal lives, they were so connected to their soul level that they actually could not separate from God. They actually couldn't be anything other than God. And so thus, this is why we see that there were certain tzaddikim that actually didn't, back in the day, they didn't live very long, because as soon as they wanted to do something that was against godliness, then they would die. Their soul would expire. Why would a tzaddik want to do something against godliness? That's a question for another time that isn't really addressed here, but that was the kind of thing that their body couldn't even stand anything that was against godliness. because its whole definition was Atzilus. This was its whole definition, and by virtue of it being its whole definition, it wasn't able to have a separate existence. So it could not be an ex nihilo. It was still in this realm of non-ex nihilo. So just to kind of recognize what's going on here is that Alter Rebbe is building up this case to really show us the contrast between those things which are the source of ex nihilo and related to ex nihilo, and those things which are not. And so he's saying very clearly that the souls of the angels and the souls of people that are found within the world of Atzilus, as lofty as they are, they're not that lofty to have been able to create something from nothing. They're still stuck in their definition of being, ironically, too close to God, kind of. In a certain sense, we can say they're too spiritual, they're too locked in their spirituality to be able to actually create something from nothing. And now we have also the Alter Rebbe goes on and gives another example of such a thing, that we see also the infinite and myriads of different worlds that are found in the Golgotha of Arich Anpin, the skull of Arich Anpin, and the Zer Anpin. So the Golgotha is the skull. That's another way of saying the Keter, the level of Keter, which is above Chochmah, so it's the level of will. It's just a very, very lofty level, basically, so it's the Keter of Keter, basically the will of the will, and also the crown of the Keter of Zer Anpin. So these are just very, very lofty levels. So the Alter Rebbe says that these very lofty levels, we can't call these levels worlds. And we say about the Hechalos of Atzilus, the chambers within the world of Atzilus, and an aspect of a yesh, of a somethingness, but rather they too are like these souls of the angels that came about through the kissing, the zivug and nishikin, the union of kissing. And so, and when we call them worlds only in relation to the aspect of the Golgotha and the Dikna, the skull and the beard, basically. So that's really, again, just kind of a technical side note here, that the basic idea that the Alter Rebbe is bringing out is that these really, really, really high levels that are really up there, that are really way beyond even worlds. We're talking about the skull of the Arich Anpin and the skull of the Zer Anpin. These things, we can't actually call them something yet. They're not actually a something. That's what's so fascinating, is it's as lofty as these things are, they're actually still on that same level. They're just like the angels. They're just like the souls of the angels, and they're just like the souls of people, that as lofty as they are, they're not quite a something. They don't really have a separate identity. They don't really have an existence of their own. And we only call them world, which implies that they are something as in terms of an existence of their own. We only call these things worlds, these levels, in relation to the aspect of the Golgotha or the Dikna, which are these very Kabbalistic things, but they're not actually worlds. And by virtue of them not actually being worlds, they're not actually godliness to be able to create something from nothing, because they already emerged out from the vessels of the 10 spheros, within which this kav is vested, and this kav comes from the infinite light of God. And so basically what the Alter Rebbe is saying here, there are different types of revelations, we can call them, or worlds or energies or that kind of thing. And some of these are quite lofty, like the souls of angels, the souls of men, these really high up there worlds where we're talking about skulls and beards and, keter and crowns and all kinds of things like that. But then there's this very specific category, which is this category of vessels. And this category of vessels has within it is what's found within this category of vessels, invested within the category of vessels, is what's known as the kav, this measuring stick. And this measuring stick comes from the infinite light of God. And so by virtue of it coming from the infinite light of God, it's sourced in origin, or the origin of which is in this infinite light of God. We know that the light is like the luminary. So it's just again, we've spoken about this before, if you see sunlight coming into the room, you can be oh, that's sun, or if there's a certain color light coming in, you can trace it back to maybe a certain type of light that's coming in that might display that kind of color, or some kind of curtain that's making it show up in such a manner. So it's the type of light has a resemblance to the luminary from which it comes from. And so in this case, what is the luminary? What is the source of the light? The source of the light here is God. The source of light is God, who is the emanator. And what's unique about God is God does not have a cause. God is the primary cause. So it's not, God is not in the realm of causality. There's nothing that caused God forbid, right? So he's the origin one. So thus when we go back to the source, when we go back to God, it's really only God that has this power to create something from nothing, like really something from true nothingness, to the point that this somethingness has no original source before it. It doesn't, other than God. Like there's no reason for it to come into being. It's not like it's being caused by something else. It's not like a chain reaction kind of thing. It's just like, no, God created this thing. And in order for this thing to come in, this somethingness to come into being in a way of limitation and measure, then it has vested within it the vessels of the 10 spheres of Atzilus. So we're back to the vessels again. So it's really the vessels that give it this power. And then it becomes united with these vessels to the point that we say that now we can understand what we say, that Ihu v'go mohi chad, he and his causations are one, or in other words, he and his vessels are one, to create through them and to create with them beings that are limited and finite in measure, and in particular through this thereby to have them be vested within the world of Bria, Yitzira, and Asiya. Okay, so that was the end of the section for today. So just to kind of like sum it up to the best of my ability, the bottom line, the message of today is really telling us the importance and the uniqueness of the vessels, and how these vessels that are found within the world of Atzilus are unique in their capacity to be able to create Ex Nihilo. And this is what God uses. These are the tools that God uses to create Ex Nihilo. And everything else that's found within the world of Atzilus, there are other aspects to the world of Atzilus which are also totally united with God and have no independent existence other than their own, but they don't express God's essence in the same way as the vessels do. So it's kind of like a paradoxical message in the sense, or a counterintuitive message in the sense that what we're saying here basically is that that which conceals God the most, because like a vessel kind of like conceals God, is actually the tool by which he creates something which is really essential to him, which is something that is unique to him. This ability to create Ex Nihilo is specifically through these vessels, which are specifically that thing which apparently, which appears to conceal God, this idea of the limitation, the finitude, and that kind of thing, versus when it comes to these other aspects that are found within the world of Atzilus, the souls of the angels, the souls of men, which are much less seemingly defined in that same way, we actually find that they are actually a lot more limited. They're limited by their attachment to godliness, by their attachment to spirituality. They can't escape from that. This is their definition, versus vessels don't have that same definition. The definition of vessels is their ability to define, but they don't inherently have any inherent definition, if that makes sense. So I know that was very esoteric today. I hope it made it a little bit more comprehensible to you. I'm sure I could have brought this down even more. Maybe next year is, Mirz Hashem, I'm going to have to redo the whole Tanya, because this year's a leap year. Next year is going to be a regular year. So maybe I'll be able to bring this down even further next time. But that is it for today. And tomorrow we will continue with this epistle. So stay tuned and I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.